Nuclear test firing fails. MPs vote on Gaza ceasefire and Prime Minister's questions at noon. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Steve Brine, Labour peer Francis O'Grady, David Linden from the Scottish National Party and Times columnist Melanie Phillips. On today's programme.
This is the worst situation I have seen in my life. It's the debris, the light, working in the darkness, patients everywhere.
The desperate humanitarian crisis in Gaza. MPs here vote on whether to call for a ceasefire. Can Labour avert a rebellion in their ranks?
We have been in discussions with the Speaker. We're hopeful that we will have the chance to put our proposition before the House, and we believe that that offers the House the best chance to speak with one clear voice.
Ship Control, take the submarine to Action Stations missile for a weapon system readiness test.
The test firing of a Trident missile from a Royal Navy submarine fails for the second time in a row. So do we have a credible nuclear deterrent? The Home Secretary sacks the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration.
It's deeply disturbing that information, which has no basis in fact, was leaked by the independent Chief Inspector to a national newspaper.
The Conservatives have broken the asylum system, bust the Home Office budget, badly undermined Britain's border security and put our country's security at risk.
All that and, of course, Prime Minister's questions live at noon. Let's start with the story you heard in the headlines on the front page of the Sun newspaper. Exclusive. Navy shock. Brit nuke sub-launch fails. It's the story that a Trident missile misfired and crashed into the ocean yards from the British nuclear submarine that launched it, and for the second time in a row. It was followed by a tweet from Newsnight's diplomatic editor Mark Urban. Quite a scoop from The Sun, he writes. Serious questions now about whether the UK's nuclear fleet remains credible. The Ministry of Defence will have its lines to take, but seems they've been sitting on this for nearly 3 weeks. Since the last test failed too in 2016, it's over a decade since a successful one. So my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Steve Brine, is our nuclear deterrent credible?
Yes, it is quite a scoop. Whether it's a responsible scoop, because I suspect our adversaries are absolutely delighted to see that undermining our CASD, our continuous at-sea deterrent this morning, is another matter. But, you know, there you go. It's a free press, right?
It is.
I'm very fortunate, and David will know the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, which we are able as members of Parliament and peers to take part in. And I'm taking part in the Army one a few years ago. I'm taking part this year in the Navy scheme. And I was able to spend a couple of days at Faslane just before Christmas, down on some of the submarines in dock, I might add, and meeting the team behind it. I am not overly concerned. I understand. No, I understand the Defence Secretary and the head of the Navy was on board when this test happened off the coast of the US. Clearly, there is only so much they can say, but it doesn't seem that there is any undermining of the independent nuclear deterrent. And there are hundreds of tests that have gone on over recent years, and there are two that have gone wrong.
Right.
That's why they test, right?
Of course, but it is a little unnerving, I suppose, if you think the last one failed too, and that was in 2016. Yeah,
but does anybody know the details? Because I suspect they're very different details as to the test that was done then and the test that was done now. Was it exactly the same thing, or were they trying to fix what went wrong? Look, the truth is that we don't know, rightly so. What our adversaries will see on the front pages of the newspapers today is that Britain's nuclear deterrent's in trouble. I don't believe it is, but as ever, I suspect Grant Shapps is rather hobbled by there's only so much he can say.
Is our nuclear deterrent credible on the back of this story that Steve Brine thinks is probably a little irresponsible?
Well, I would have thought that the House and the country are going to be looking for a lot of reassurance in the wake of that story. And, you know, I have to say that there's a bigger issue about the defence sector. You know, there's something, the vision of Grant Shapps on board when this all happens, I think feels like a terrible metaphor for what's happening in the country. We know about the squeeze on budgets. We know we've got 25,000 fewer troops than we had in 2010. We know how important the defence sector is for jobs, but lots of procurement failures too. So, you know, it feels like this is a time, especially in a world that at the moment feels really unsafe, where we need a proper strategic review and a look at what are the real threats that we face and what's the best way to meet them. Is our nuclear deterrent credible?
Well, it will come as no surprise that as somebody who's a member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, that I don't think that having Trident missiles is particularly makes us safe. Also have the joy of living just about 40 miles along the road from where our nuclear weapons are stationed. I think at a time when we have a cost of living crisis, the idea that we spend hundreds of millions of pounds on weapons that frankly we would probably never use.
That's why they're a deterrent.
It raises all sorts of questions about the effectiveness of it, and I'd rather see that money ploughed into things like more conventional forces and other aspects of our economy. The SNP's position on it has always been that we would be a member of NATO, but not a nuclear member, because we don't agree with Trident nuclear weapons. They don't make us any safer, and what they're defending, they're defending the food banks in my constituency.
Well, Melanie, what's your view? Is our nuclear deterrent credible?
I don't think it's made incredible by this particular incident. Clearly, it didn't go well. Clearly, it's a major embarrassment. We're told that it was human error, but the missiles themselves are fine. And I understand from commentary that the incident in 2016 was also human error. In other words, the information being programmed into the missile system failed. That isn't altogether reassuring, I have to say. But nevertheless, the idea that these incidents, which, if it's true, depended on human error, the idea that sort of obviates the deterrent nature of the missile program, I think is absurd. What I think is actually more serious is that deterrence only works. A country only deters the enemy if the enemy believes you're actually going to use the weapon. And I think this goes beyond nuclear, the issue of nuclear weapons. I think the West generally is giving all our enemies the impression that we are no longer prepared to fight and die for what we believe in. We no longer even know what we believe in. That's what they all think, and we see the empowerment of rogue actors, Putin, Iran, China, because of this impression. So, you know, fine to have a deterrent of any kind, very important. But in order to deter, which is crucial, we have to mean what we say.
What is undoubtedly true is that the Army has got a challenge with recruitment, big time, and the Navy particularly have as well, and within that, submariners is a really, really difficult recruitment challenge. People don't want to do it. And so then you've got the engineers and the key people that are keeping this stuff safe and keeping this stuff working, or meant to be. They are often being poached by private sector contractors, military contractors, MOD contractors, who are able to pay them much more in the private sector. So where I would agree there definitely will be questions asked, I don't think there'll be questions answered in the open house, but the Intelligence and Security Committee, I'm pretty sure that they will be looking at this pronto.
Right, let's talk about a Commons debate and vote that is happening this afternoon. It's an opposition day debate that's been brought by the SNP, David Linden's party. It is about whether to call for a ceasefire in Israel and Gaza. Now, it is quite complicated from a parliamentary procedure point of view, but let's try and guide you through it. First of all, if we can show you some of the motion first and then amendments that have been put forward by other parties. So, ceasefire in Gaza. The SNP is saying an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. It is a lot longer than that, but that is the sort of headline. The Labour Party has put forward an amendment which says an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. And the government has also put forward an amendment to the SNP motion which says an immediate humanitarian pause. Now, on the face of it, they look pretty similar, but there are differences. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Leila Nathoo. What is the difference, or what are the differences between the motion and the amendments, Leila?
Well, they are quite subtle. As you say, Jo, I mean, the immediate difference is that the Labour motion goes a lot further. There are a lot more qualifications. The SNP motion is quite straightforward, basically calling for an immediate ceasefire. The Labour motion inserts the word humanitarian in there, immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and talks about Israel being not being expected to cease fighting. There are a few more qualifications. It also doesn't repeat the language used in the SNP motion, which refers to the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. So that is a notable difference between those two motions. But the main difference is that actually, because the government has put forward its own amendment now, there is some uncertainty as to whether Labour will actually even get to vote on this amendment at all, whether it will be selected, because this was designed, the Labour amendment, to really neutralise the divisions within the Labour Party, so that Labour MPs wouldn't be forced, if they wanted to express support for a ceasefire, to support the SNP motion. They could actually support the Labour version instead, which all the Labour MPs would have been expected to get behind. Now we've got this jeopardy of the government amendment being selected instead, which reintroduces that risk for Keir Starmer that MPs will rebel.
Right, so it's a potential headache for the Labour Party and for Sir Keir Starmer. Beyond Westminster, what is the significance and the meaning of what's happening this afternoon?
Well, the SNP have essentially used their parliamentary moment to force this issue for Labour. Yes, it doesn't make a difference in terms of a material impact of government policy, although we have seen a restatement of the government policy, which is this idea of a humanitarian pause and then a permanent, sustainable ceasefire in the longer term as an aim. So that is actually a sort of difference now between the UK government position and, you know, you already have the US, for example, calling explicitly now for a temporary ceasefire. So a slight difference in language being exposed in the government position. It is more of an internal Westminster issue in terms of forcing the Labour Party's hand on this. But I think it will be problematic for Keir Starmer if the Labour amendment is not selected, because it will show again the divisions in the Labour Party. And remember, Labour MPs are still very much under pressure on this. They are still getting pressure from their constituents, very much so on this issue. Remember, the last time it was forced was November. You had more than 56 rebellions on the Labour side. Then we had a handful of resignations from the Labour front bench. So in terms of what the impact could be more broadly, it will expose Labour divisions again, once again on this, put pressure on Keir Starmer over what has been a very tricky issue for him in recent months.
Leila Nathoo, thank you very much. Well, let's pick up on that with you, David Linden, because listening to Leila Nathoo there, is that the primary reason that you've called this Opposition Day debate on an extremely sensitive and explosive issue across the world, is to expose divisions in your political opponents?
No, not at all. Look, Jo, I've been a Member of Parliament for 6 years. In that time, I've seen Brexit, I've seen a pandemic, I've seen a recession, I've seen military conflict in Ukraine, Afghanistan. But no issue has dominated my inbox more as an MP than the tragedy that is playing out in Gaza at the moment. Now, I'm not particularly interested in the internal party management that Sir Keir Starmer has got to navigate at the moment. As far as I'm concerned, when I turn my television on every single night, I am confronted with the images of children who are dying. I'm seeing that there is difficulty in terms of medicine, food, water, energy getting through. I do believe that there is collective punishment ongoing in Gaza. And so for me, frankly, I'm not interested in dancing on the head of a pin of
So why didn't you work with Labour and have an amendment that was strongly worded that both of you could agree on, rather than this internal politics?
It's not internal politics, and that's actually precisely why Stephen Flynn, the SNP Westminster leader, wrote to Sir Keir Starmer earlier in the week. We had the opportunity for them to engage with that. Where I understand the issue for Labour is that they are not happy with the
I'll ask them.
Punishment.
I'll ask Labour what their position is. But just listening, what do you make of the Opposition Day debate and the motion that is being put forward?
Well, I think certain things need to be said. First of all, I think all decent people will be appalled and horrified by the scenes of devastation in Gaza. But it's very important to understand that those scenes of devastation are caused by the fact that Hamas sited its infrastructure of genocidal terror underneath the civilian infrastructure of Gaza, necessitating bombing. And this terrible war, this devastation could end tomorrow. It could end today if Hamas gave up and decided no longer to attack Israel and release the hostages. You see, if Israel is required to cease fire, that means that Hamas will basically not be defeated as a military force, and that means that more Israelis will undoubtedly be subjected to murder, rape, barbarism, kidnapping. That will follow inevitably. We know that because Hamas have told us they will repeat the atrocities of October 7 again and again until Israel is wiped out. That is what people who are voting for an immediate ceasefire are, in effect, voting to bring about.
Is that what you're doing, David?
No. Let's not forget, Jo, 30,000 people, largely women and children, have lost their life as a result of the ongoing assault. What we're seeing about to play out in Rafah, for example, what we're seeing in the West Bank, is deeply troubling. And that's why I want to see that immediate ceasefire. I want to see that ceasefire now, because at the moment we have a humanitarian crisis playing out. And the idea that we are sitting here in a London TV studio going over the intricacy of words and dancing on the head of a pin, whilst women and children are being killed every single day, is unsustainable. That's why we need a ceasefire now, and that's why the motion that the SNP has brought forward, which is supported by a number of organisations.
Yes.
Can I just make one point on that? 30,000 dead, we're told, assuming that figure is correct, and we don't know because it's a Hamas figure.
It is.
But I wonder why people like David never say that among that 30,000 is several thousand Hamas terrorists who've been killed.
Of course there are.
You don't say that. You say women and children. It's emotive. I think what people hear
Are you disputing
in Britain,
that women and children are dying?
No,
needlessly?
and it's terrible that women and children are dying. Terrible. But
so that's why we need a ceasefire.
But the ceasefire would mean more women and children would be raped, murdered, and taken hostage if they are Israelis. You don't say anything about that. I think people in Britain need to understand this is not even just a question of returning the 134 Israeli hostages who are still being held in Gaza. Israelis believe correctly they are actually fighting for their lives here. If there is a ceasefire, more Israelis will be sentenced by people like David to be murdered, raped and kidnapped.
Well,
that is the effect of an immediate ceasefire.
Let David respond.
This is an incredibly sensitive subject, and for somehow trying to lay that at the door of myself when we have called out...
Yes, genocide is a sensitive subject if you're on the receiving end of it, actually.
Well, hang on.
That's why we need a ceasefire.
You are here. The people in Israel are facing a genocidal threat which is continuing every day.
Let me just put something to both of you. First of all, though, to you, Melanie, the idea that Israel has a right to defend itself. Everyone has said that they agree with that. But is it true, and is it the case now, when the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, said it has gone beyond what you might say is legitimate self-defence, in terms of the numbers of Palestinians and Gazans that have been killed?
Okay. Well, I don't know what that means.
Well, have Hamas's capabilities been degraded enough now?
Gone too far, beyond legitimate self-defence, whatever. The fact is that the ratio of civilians to Hamas terrorists killed in this war ranges between 1 to 1, which is what the Israelis say, and 1 to 3. In other words, 3 civilians maximum to every... Hang on, wait, let me finish.
Hang on, let her finish and then I'll come. I've got a question for you.
3 civilians killed to every 1 terrorist. That is infinitely lower as a number of civilians killed to what the British government has done and the Americans in Iraq, Afghanistan.
All right, but there is also a question about what makes either side or both sides feel safe. David, the question to you is that if Hamas's capabilities have not been degraded, Hamas as an organisation is very clear about its intent. It would repeat the massacre that it committed on October the 7th, and it doesn't hold back on that issue. So if hostages weren't to be released, if your motion, let's say, had any impact in terms of real-life consequences as to what's happening out there, would you say that Israel still has to cease fighting?
Well, look, I think the first thing to be absolutely clear about is we have done from day one on the 7th of October is to condemn Hamas for that atrocity that was committed in Israel. There's no doubt about that. But where we are ending up at the moment, and where the SNP has tried since November to get people into the space of, is to follow everybody else in the international community, whether that's the Pope, the Holy Father, whether that's Emmanuel Macron.
I know this, but dates are
ceasefire.
important here. It happened on the 7th of October. Hamza Yousaf, Scotland's First Minister, called for an immediate ceasefire on the 27th of October, within weeks of 1,400...
Thousands of people had been killed.
Well, hang on. The ground invasion by Israel had either just happened or was about to happen. You were already calling then. Was that position right, to call for an immediate ceasefire by Israel within weeks of its citizens being massacred?
Yes, I do think so, because we're in a situation where a humanitarian crisis is now playing out in Gaza. And we cannot stand by and watch this barbarism continue. Let's not forget, the ICJ have opened an investigation as to whether genocide is being committed at the moment. And for me as a politician who's been elected, unlike Melanie, to stand by and ignore the thousands of constituents who say to me, this is an unsustainable situation, there is collective punishment, not to go and vote for that today would be an abdication of responsibility on my part as Member of Parliament.
Well, let's bring it back to politics here, because it is a headache for the Labour Party and for Sir Keir Starmer. It's only literally within the last few days that the party has shifted its position to be closer to the SNPs, but actually in the end, MPs may not have a chance to vote for that amendment. And in that case and in that position, what should Labour MPs do? Back the SNP?
Well, that's going to be a matter for Labour MPs, and I'm not one of them.
Yeah, but come on, you speak for the Labour Party for answers.
The important thing is that Labour has set out its position, and I think listening to the debate, what strikes me is that most people, we all want peace. Most of us want a two-state solution of neighbours being able to live in security and respect alongside each other. We are in the middle of a crisis which is horrific for the Palestinian people. It is also horrific for the families of the hostages who are demonstrating every Saturday calling for a negotiated solution. And, you know, my background is a trade unionist. I don't apologise for my belief in the power of negotiation to be able to find a way through,
if you
even
were
in the
voting,
midst of such horror.
You aren't voting this afternoon, but I think it's incumbent on you and others to say what you would do.
Well,
what would you do in this position in such an important issue?
Is that having set out its position, that, you know, my inclination, I hope that the Labour motion is taken, which I hope can bring people together, because I think it's important that people do come together, not least for communities here in Britain, where we're seeing this horrific rise in anti-Semitic attacks and also Islamophobia. So it's important that we try and bring people together. I would vote for the motion because I think two things have happened. One, we've had the ICJ provisional ruling on getting humanitarian aid in and preventing genocide. Secondly, we've got Rafah. We've got 1.5 million people in a city being expected to move to an area the size of an airport, I understand, with no facilities, no infrastructure.
No, it's desperate.
And it is desperate.
Right, so you would back the SNP motion if Labour, just to be clear, I understand
that. And it's not just the SNP. We've got Prince William. We'll come on
to Prince William in just a moment.
Australia, Canada, New Zealand.
But you would back the SNP motion, just to be clear.
Personally, I would.
Right, Steve.
As would, by the way, the Scottish Labour Party, who passed the motion at their conference.
Thank you.
Talking about collective punishment.
Yes, they did.
Just to be clear.
Steve, the government's position, is it behind the curve in terms of calling for a pause rather than a ceasefire, a temporary pause rather than a ceasefire? Even the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, seems to be moving towards the position of the opposition parties.
No, the government's position is a governing party's decision, not, with respect, a third-party decision. And look at it says it along the bottom of your screen, Commons to vote on Gaza ceasefire. We're all getting emails from constituents who think that if we vote for the amendment today, then suddenly Netanyahu will go, OK, then London have said we must stop. The truth is that if 650 MPs, 2-0, voted for the SNP motion today, it would change nothing. This is an opposition day. The clue is in the name. And it seems like a long time ago now, but going back to your first question, is this to cause trouble for Labour? Well, David will have to search his heart as to whether it is. Of course it is to cause trouble for Labour, and it's causing massive trouble for Labour. And the anxiety is that the Speaker won't call the Labour amendment.
Yeah, but why?
But the
government put down an amendment.
Yes.
Too. So is that not also party political?
And they are the government, and so therefore it would be every right for them to select the government amendment. And I have it here in today's order paper, and I have absolutely no issue with it. Immediate humanitarian pause, permanent sustainable ceasefire. The SNP motion doesn't. I know they've said that they've expressed regret at what happened October 7th. Doesn't say it in the motion that I'd be asked to vote for today. And also, I'm not voting for a unilateral Israeli laying down of arms, while Hamas have said they'll continue to lob rockets into Israel. And all that will happen, as Melanie says, is that more Israelis will die, and then as a result, Israel will hammer even harder and more Palestinians will die.
I go back to my other question, which was about whether the government, and you're quite right about the Opposition Day debate, whether the government's behind the curve, because even the US, Israel's main, most staunch ally, has said this in the Daily Mail: US pushes for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, not a pause, and warns Israel against assault on Rafah, as was being talked about by Francis, as Biden's White House turns even further against the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Yeah, I don't see any difference between that and
well, because a ceasefire is different
to
to a pause, isn't it? A pause in the fighting, but a ceasefire would mean ceasing hostilities on both sides.
With the greatest respect, the words that Biden says one day, you never know what he's going to say the next.
All right, well, that's a slight deflection.
No, it's not deflection. It's just reality of what people's grave concern is in Washington right now about the US president, who is the only one that really matters in this outside of Israel. I have no issue with the Prime Minister's amendment today, and if it's selected, I will be voting for it.
Let me just show you, because you mentioned Prince William. Melanie, the Daily Telegraph, in fact, we have a few paper front pages. William, fighting in Gaza must be brought to an end. I think we have the Daily Mail that comes afterwards. William, too many people have died in Gaza conflict. And then the Eye has royal diplomat, UK deploys Prince William to call for urgent Gaza ceasefire. Was he right to intervene in this way?
Well, the way it's being reported is not quite what he said. I think he phrased it extremely carefully. He didn't call for a ceasefire. He didn't demand or urge a ceasefire. He said, I want, like many people, I'm paraphrasing, I want to see an end to the fighting. We all want to see an end to the fighting.
He did say too many have died. He did say too many have died in the Gaza conflict.
We want to see an end to the fighting. It's fine as far as it goes. But so you could say it was simply a pious declaration of, we all want to see an end to the fighting. But two things. First of all, it is a highly controversial issue. And secondly, it was on the eve of this very important vote today. We all know that the monarchy stands above all divisive issues. It never, ever gets involved. Why on earth did he choose to do this? And secondly, I don't think it can be simply a pious expression of, we want to see killing ended, which we all do, because he said too many have been killed. Now, again, he could say, and his defenders would say, well, it's quite obvious too many have been killed. But the fact is that too many have been killed, in a broad sense, implies that Israel is killing too many. Now, all civilians who die in war is a tragedy. It's very regrettable. But the point is, this is a just war. Even in just wars, civilians unfortunately get killed. The crucial thing is, when he says too many, how many is too many? Too many Hamas terrorists who've been killed among the 30,000?
Well, of course, we don't
how
know.
Many? How many? Okay, too many children. Of course, in a just war, too many children are killed.
And many more
but
starving.
In this war, fewer civilians have been killed.
All right, I know you've made that calculation, but let me just come back to whether it was right for Prince William to say what he said.
We all know how this works in terms of when the royal family decide to speak out. I am not a great defender of the royal family, I must admit, but Prince William, in making those comments, would have known fine well what the front pages of today's newspapers would look like. And Buckingham Palace sources have always been quick in the past to put out rebuttals. I note in today's media, there's no rebuttal to say, oh, he misspoke. The reality is, we've got Prince William, we've got the Pope, the Holy Father, we've got President Emmanuel Macron, all calling for this immediate ceasefire, yet we find ourselves in this London TV studio dancing on the head of a pin over words when women and children are dying. That's why we need a ceasefire now. If Prince William can call for it, then I expect MP should be able to do so.
And Number 10 must have given it its blessing.
Well, presumably so, but again, who knows? I'm looking at headlines on your table here. Fighting in Gaza must be brought to an end. Check, agree. Too many have died. Check, agree. How many are too many? But, the point is that I have no issue with where the international community is, because I think it is moving in the direction of agreeing a permanent, sustainable ceasefire, which has to include both sides. But you have a situation here where Israel no longer, well, the Prime Minister of Israel said he doesn't agree with a two-state solution, and you have the Palestinian side who talk about from the river to the sea. So that is an intractable position. And so if we can get to a permanent, sustainable ceasefire, then I will be delighted, but I will be surprised. What happens in the House of Commons this afternoon is not going to get
There is a point here, though, that if
Joe
Biden came out tonight or tomorrow and said he was in support of an immediate ceasefire, we all know that politicians in London would file in behind that, wouldn't they, Steve?
Well, I don't think that, as I said earlier, I don't think there is a big gap between what Biden is saying and what the Prime Minister here is saying. But again, you know, Netanyahu is in a very difficult domestic political situation. And with the US President, according to polls, heading towards the exit door, how much notice does he take?
Right. I mean, the question will be at the end of this afternoon whether or not Sir Keir Starmer, one of the questions, whether or not Sir Keir Starmer has held his party together. And you know last time that when the SNP called a similar motion and vote that 56 Labour MPs rebelled and voted for the SNP motion, which you say you would support. David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has talked about collective responsibility here. Should people be sacked on the front bench in Labour if they again back David Linden?
I'm not going to speculate. I mean, we don't even know whether the motion's going to be taken yet. So I think we need to see how that unfolds. But I think we're underestimating the British people here, because I think there is a real appetite. You know, we know from countries like Colombia, from our experience in Ireland, from South Africa, where even in the most intractable situations, it is possible to find a solution, a negotiated solution. And that takes huge diplomatic effort. It takes civic society rallying behind that too. And I just think, you know, we all want peace. The question is how, but we have to ratchet up the pressure.
Huge diplomatic effort isn't happening with the regional powers.
Behind the scenes.
That is happening all the time. And I suspect Lord Cameron is at the centre of it, and I sincerely hope he is.
All right, we're going to talk about something completely different. BBC News. David Neil, this is the story. Immigration and Border Watchdog sacked for leaking critical reports, and they included about security lapses around private jets landing at London City Airport. David Neil, the Immigration and Borders Watchdog, was sacked last night by the Home Secretary after leaking reports to the press. Now, news of the sacking came after an exchange in the Commons yesterday lunchtime. I think we can play you some of that exchange with the Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper and the Immigration Minister Tom Pursglove. Or maybe not. No, don't worry, it seems to have frozen. Let's just show you the Daily Mail headline. Hundreds of high-risk flights land in the UK unchecked. Borders Watchdog issues dramatic warning amid a major new immigration scandal. Didn't he do the right thing, Steve?
What
David
Mr.
Neil?
Well, not if he's lost the confidence of the Home Secretary and he's breached the terms of his employment, then I can see why he was dismissed. Just for the record, it's the 20th of February yesterday. His contract is due to end on the 21st of March. So it's 1 month early. So I would wonder why have the row, frankly. But, you know, like the last story we were talking about, where are the public watching politicians arguing while people are dying? With the post office story, they're watching a row while the postmaster's not getting money.
But he does raise some interesting issues, doesn't he, about security?
But as chair of the Health Committee and the Health and Social Care Committee, I'm actually more concerned about the regulations that are being passed, which I have spoken out about, which we have taken clear evidence about, which is that if you ban relatives coming here with care workers, they have already proved that they are internationally mobile, and they will be internationally mobile elsewhere. And we have taken clear evidence on the Select Committee from that. We have written to the Home Secretary and to the Immigration Minister, the Legal Immigration Minister, to seek more detail as what they said when they've done the workings out around this policy, because I want to see their impact assessment on this. I think it will hurt the care sector. Right.
Well, we'll talk about the care sector in just a moment. But in terms of what David Neil said, Melanie, when you saw the story and the headlines, did you think, my goodness, we need some reassurance on security at airports?
I think we need some reassurance about the Home Office, quite frankly, and the border force, which seems to be in mutually assured destructive chaos, frankly. I mean, here you have a situation in which the Home Office is basically denying what David Neil has alleged. The Home Office is saying he's got his figures wrong, and we've told him so. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I do note that the Home Office has not provided the breakdown of high risk and low risk immigration classifications, which the whole thing revolves around. So that seems to me a little suspicious. Furthermore, if it's the case that I read, that 15 reports by David Neal have been sat on by the Home Office. You wonder what on earth is going on here. It looks as if, the evidence looks as if, here is somebody who was desperately trying to alert the Home Office to something going fundamentally wrong with security to do with immigration, was being ignored, was told that his contract wasn't going to be renewed and he would have to reapply, and then went for broke and leaked it.
Well, and this is what you were talking about. In the Times, 1 in 4 foreign care workers abuse UK visa rules. Inspections revealed that the Home Office issued 275 visas to a care home that didn't exist.
And you see, it's a curious one because that plays to the government's argument. I mean, I may take issue with it based on the evidence, but that plays to the government's argument that he's saying that, which is that people are abusing the health and care visa
but what
route.
about what Melanie is saying substantially? That he couldn't get the Home Secretary's attention. He's trying to bring these reports to the government's attention, and in the end...
met.
And they haven't.
Well, I'm not a member of the government. That troubles me greatly. I have a funny feeling that Mr Neal may emerge with another exclusive in Melanie's newspaper this weekend. I suspect that's being lined up as we speak. But, you know, just to return to the care issue, government said when they announced this policy at the start of the year around dependents coming with care workers that, you know, when people come in as dependents, it impacts on school places, it impacts on doctors' appointments. Yes, it may, although I wonder just how much it does. But maybe that's the price that we have to pay as a society to have the people who are prepared to staff our care sector, because bluntly, the domestic workforce don't want to do it. And they are internationally mobile, and we should be welcoming them here.
Right. Well,
what a shambles, first of all. We've got 15 reports. What on earth has the government got to hide in that it's not publishing the reports? A former army officer, I think, that the inspector has produced.
But on the substance, because that's what Steve has moved on to. Should care workers and their dependents be allowed into the country?
Again, the government not dealing with the root cause of the problem. We've got 150,000 vacancies. Why? Because the majority of care workers are on less than the independent real living wage of £12 an hour, and a quarter of them are on 0 hours contracts. Let's, for goodness sake, if we want to attract people to that vocation, then let's raise professional standards, let's raise standards of work, so it's a decent job and a career.
And should care workers bring dependents into the
I think absolutely the evidence you've heard, I have heard with, you know, buckets full of it, which is that if you're asking people to come and look after our families by leaving their own, you are not going to fill those 150,000.
Why would you come and do it?
And also, we need to crack down on some of those agents and companies who are bringing people over, who are bringing them over on contracts that cost £25,000, and then that's deducted from their wages.
So they should be able to bring independence, and you would like to see a Labour
Let's not make the bad the enemy of the good on this one.
I mean, and shouldn't it? I mean, it will cause chaos in the care sector. People won't come. Why would they?
Well, the idea that people in general won't come unless they bring their dependents is not true. In Israel, which I know very well, the care workers are sending money, huge amounts of money in their terms, back to families at home which they're supporting. That is the pattern there. Bringing dependents in here into this country has caused a crisis in immigration. This country cannot cope with the number of immigrants it's bringing in. Immigrants, as we know, are a blessing in that they bring a vast amount of stuff, both practical and not practical, which the country needs. But there comes a point where the country's infrastructure simply cannot cope.
All right, well,
the number of dependents has hugely exacerbated that problem.
I mean, David, let me just show you. James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, today in Parliament, we've laid an order to ban overseas care workers from bringing dependents. This is just one part of our plan to deliver the biggest ever cut in migration.
Really depressing, actually, because we've got a government that's pretty much falling apart. It can't fire Trident missiles that fail.
But on the substance,
it's clearly falling apart. But as a result of sitting in 15 reports, look, I think it's clear as day. The Conservatives want to weaponise immigration in the run-up to this election. We're in an election year. I understand that tempers will run high. But to be honest, in my constituency, and I've got care homes in there, like Steve, I understand the health and social care sector well. the biggest, most overwhelming thing that my constituents, and in particular the care sector, tell me is that immigration has not been our problem, it's emigration. The reality is we're all living longer with more complex health conditions. And Steve's right, when I go into some of my local schools and I ask the kids, what do you want to do when you go out to work? None of them want to go out and work in an environment where they're having to wipe people's bottoms or feed people. The reality is that we are having this false debate about immigration. We're weaponising it as a result of an election coming up, when all the while our economy needs people to come here and work. And this idea that we scapegoat
Can I just say, David,
kids,
the care workers I know and speak to love their jobs.
They do.
They have a
but they need
real
more support.
sense of vocation.
Yeah.
But they are really angry that they are paid a pittance
exactly.
for the work
So
that
why does Labour want to keep, we can show you this in the eye, want to keep the migration crackdown on health worker relatives?
Is they're terrified of the red wall?
I think Labour is talking about investing in having a proper fair pay agreement for the sector, of investing in training and professional standards and making it a genuine career
They may want
choice
that,
for
but they
people.
agree with the government, it looks like here. They want to keep that
I haven't
migration
seen that
crackdown.
story.
I mean, Steve, you say it's because of the red wall, it's because of
It
votes.
is. They're
That's
playing,
cynical, isn't it?
they're playing keep-upmanship with the government on this issue. And
Perhaps the government will support a fair pay agreement for care
Francis,
workers.
right, I completely agree with you, right?
£12.
The longer burn is that we need a domestic care workforce that is paid better. But if you cut off that workforce supply right now, in the pursuit of cutting immigration numbers, I predict to you that the people who are not there to look after mum or dad with dementia in the care home will matter more to the voters later this year than it will the immigration numbers.
Everybody should get paid the rate for the
100%,
job
and we've
and
taken-
a fair rate
Well,
for the
Francis,
job.
you two
plenty of
agree.
evidence.
You agree
They
with
hold.
Conservative MP Steve Brine. You don't agree with the Shadow Health Secretary, Labour Shadow Health Secretary, Home Secretary, I should say, Yvette Cooper.
Well, I haven't even read that story,
Well, I'm
so I'm not sure on what basis you're saying
But
that.
Labour
What
have
I'm
said that
saying
they
is
will keep that migration crackdown on health worker
Labour
relatives.
has been very clear that we should not use or exploit, as some of these companies are doing, migrant workers. What we need is a fair pay for the job, fair rate for the job for every care worker, regardless of where they come from.
And just finally, Steve, I mean, the rhetoric, David Clinton's right, the rhetoric from the government is really tough on immigration. It's really harsh, you could argue. The reality, clearly, when you look at the loopholes, unchecked at airports, care visa scams, the reality is totally different. Why? What's the point of all that harsh rhetoric if none of it actually bears any resemblance to what's
showing in the polls? And I can tell you now that my constituency in Winchester don't like this rhetoric, and I don't like this rhetoric. Yes, clamp down on the people coming in and abusing the health and care visa route, but don't cut off your nose to spite your face in pursuit of numbers, because when they're not there to look after mum and dad, it will be a bigger election issue than the immigration numbers, in my opinion.
Right. Prime Minister's questions coming up in a few minutes' time. But let's have a look. It's filling up, and I'm not surprised. There's Peter Kyle there, who is the Shadow Technology Minister for Labour. Not surprised, bearing in mind there are so many pressing issues, and also ahead of that debate and vote this afternoon that we've talked about. We have got time for one more story, which is ongoing. The row between the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, and the former Post Office Chairman, Henry Staunton. Let's just show you this in the Times. Post Office boss was told, don't rip off the Band-Aid on finances. Memo of Henry Staunton's meeting with top civil servant last year says scandal hit company was ordered to hobble into election. Let's talk to Leila Nathoo again. Yes, what's the latest?
Well, it's another escalation on the part of Henry Staunton that started from his interview on Sunday with the Sunday Times, when he made a couple of explosive claims, one about the nature of the conversation he had with Kemi Badenoch last month when he was dismissed, and the other in which he said that he was told to stall compensation payments to wronged postmasters caught up in the Horizon scandal by a senior official in the business department. So hugely controversial claim there. It triggered a furious response from Kemi Badenoch, who accused him of lying and said it was a made-up anecdote, and challenged him to produce some evidence. So today he has made made public a note that he made at the time of that conversation he had with the top civil servant at the business department back in last January, a note that he emailed himself on that day when he said that he was told that there was not that was not the time to deal with long-term issues in the Post Office, and the Post Office should hobble into the next election. So his initial recollection was the word limp. He now produces this note that says it was hobble. So it's an escalation of this row. The government's hit back and said he's misrepresenting that conversation with officials. I suspect this is not quite the end of the story, because he's going to be summoned before the Business Select Committee next week. But it's clear in his mind that that conversation suggested to him that he was being told to go slow on these compensation payments. But we'll hear more of it next week.
Leila, thank you very much. Steve, what do you make, or what do you think about the way the Business Secretary's gone about this?
Hell hath no fury like a Henry scorned. He was dismissed, and I suspect she thinks there's a good reason why. She said that Miss Mumby, who is the civil servant who apparently made this claim, denies it, so I hear. I don't think, with respect, that the Times come out of this brilliantly well as it stands, but that there'll be more to come on this. And in the middle of this, if it was to stall, well, it hasn't really been very well listened to, has it? Because we're overturning convictions and we're getting compensation out the door of the sub-postmasters.
But I asked about the way, Kemi Bain, not the name calling.
Well, it's confrontational, right? And I'm sure it plays well with a certain audience. But I think the sub-postmasters are probably left pretty cold by it.
The Conservative cabinet is rapidly turning into Millwall. Nobody likes us and we don't care. I mean, it seems to be picking fights all over the place. Well, and actually what we should be focused on is getting that compensation and justice for the postmasters as fast as possible.
Which we are.
It's now time for Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in sending our deepest condolences to the family of Alexei Navalny. He died for a cause to which he dedicated his whole life, freedom, and to return home knowing that Putin had already tried to have him killed was one of the most courageous acts of our time. Together with our allies, we are considering all options to hold Russia and Putin to account, and this morning we sanctioned those running the prison where Alexei Navalny's body still lies. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
I know that my right honourable friend will share my horror felt by this House, the oldest People's Assembly in the world, at the acid attack against a woman and 2 children on the streets of London. Does he share my anger that we would still not have been able to deport the perpetrator had he been found because of the so-called European Court of Human Rights? When will we stop bending the knee to this so-called European Court, a travesty of a court?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this was a horrific attack, and my thoughts are with the victim and their families. Obviously, I can't comment on a live investigation, but speaking more broadly, clearly, I don't think it's right for dangerous foreign criminals to be able to stay in our country. And that's why our Nationality and Borders Act made it clear that anyone who is convicted of a crime and gets a sentence of 12 months or more will not be granted asylum in the United Kingdom. That is the common sense position that I believe is supported by the majority of the British public, but one that the Labour Party voted against time and time again.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the new member for Wellingborough and the new member for Kingswood? I know they will both be powerful advocates for their constituents. On a more sombre note, Mr. Speaker, can I join with the Prime Minister? I was glad to hear what he just had to say, because I'm sure the whole House will join me in sharing our disgust at the death of Alexei Navalny, who, as the Prime Minister said, died because of his efforts to expose the corruption of the Putin regime. It is a reminder that Putin has stolen not just the wealth, but also the future and democracy of the Russian people. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister be prepared personally to repeat the allegation made by his business secretary that the former chair of the Post Office is lying when he says he was told to go slow on compensation for postmasters and limp to the next election?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, as the Business Secretary said on Monday, she asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. She set out the reasons for this and the full background in the House earlier this week. But importantly, we have also taken unprecedented steps to ensure that victims of the Horizon scandal do receive compensation as swiftly as possible and in full. Making sure that victims receive justice and compensation remains our #1 priority, and we will shortly bring forward legislation to address this matter soon.
I'm not sure that takes us very much further forward, so let me press on, because on Monday the Business Secretary also confirmed categorically that the Post Office was, and I'll quote this in fairness to the Prime Minister, at no point told to delay compensation payments by either an official or a minister from any government department, and at no point was it suggested that a delay would be of benefit to the Treasury. So that's Monday. A note released by the former Post Office chair this morning appears to directly contradict that. And I appreciate the business. This really matters to the people who've been at the heart. I appreciate that the Business Secretary has put the Prime Minister in a tricky position. But will he commit to investigating this matter properly, including whether that categorical statement was correct and why, rather than taking those accusations seriously, she accused a whistleblower of lying?
Mr. Speaker, it is worth bearing in mind that, as the Business Secretary said on Monday, she asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. But this is, on a matter of substance, one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history, because people who were working hard serving their communities had their lives and reputations destroyed, and that's why we are working hard to ensure that they get justice and compensation, and that's why we established Sir Win Williams' inquiry. It's why we've already paid out over £150 million of compensation to almost 3,000 victims, and it's why we will introduce new legislation shortly to exonerate those. We will make sure that we do what is needed, that the truth does come to light, we right the wrongs of the past, and crucially, that victims get the justice that they deserve.
Mr. Speaker, I do hope the Prime Minister will instigate that investigation into what was said on Monday, because one of the features of this miscarriage is that where concerns have been raised, they've been pushed to one side. And this week we also learned that a 2016 investigation into whether Post Office branch accounts could be altered was suddenly stopped before it was completed. Now, had that investigation revealed that they could be altered, which we now know to be the case, the livelihoods of those wrongly prosecuted could have been saved. What did government ministers know about it at the time?
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has picked one particular date, but it is worth bearing in mind that this scandal has unfolded over decades, Mr. Speaker, and it was actually following a landmark 2019 High Court case that the previous government established a statutory inquiry led by Sir Win Williams, which is uncovering exactly what went wrong, Mr. Speaker, and it is right that that inquiry is allowed to do its work. But also, Mr. Speaker, following the High Court case, the government established an independent advisory board, established not one but 3 different compensation schemes, and as of now, over 2/3 of people have received full and final offers, because what we are focused on is making sure that the victims get the justice and the compensation that they deserve.
Mr. Speaker, this information about 2016 has just come to light, I think, this week, which is precisely why I'm asking about it. Exactly. Considering the Prime Minister's Foreign Secretary was running the government in 2016, and one of the Prime Minister's current Cabinet Office ministers was the Post Office Minister, has he thought to ask either of them what they knew in 2016?
No, Mr. Speaker. We did the right thing, which was to set up an independent statutory inquiry. That is the right way to resolve this issue. It's the right way to get victims the truth and the answers they demand. But this government is getting them the compensation that they rightly deserve.
Mr. Speaker, as we all know, the Horizon scandal left people isolated, their livelihoods lost, their lives ruined. Some died without ever getting the justice that they deserve. Fears of delay, Prime Minister, or cover-up are causing them anguish. And yesterday, Chris Head, once accused by the Post Office of owing more than £80,000, he said this yesterday: there is a lack of transparency. We need to see the correspondence between the Post Office, the Department and UKGI, because all of the time everything gets shrouded in secrecy. This is his words. Have some respect, please. He's a victim. Now, I appreciate the inquiry is ongoing, but as the Prime Minister knows, and so do I, so does the whole House, that does not provide a reason why he can't draw a line under this, give postmasters like Chris the peace of mind they need, and release all of the correspondence that he wants to see. Will he now do so?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, this is one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our country's history. I don't think that the Leader of the Opposition ever raised with me over these exchanges over the past year. But we are working hard to get victims not just the answers, but the compensation they deserve. But we do now have a statutory inquiry led by Sir Win Williams, who has the powers to get access to all the documentation that he requires, speak to everybody that he needs to. That is the right and proper way to get the truth that the victims deserve. But in the meantime, we are not wasting a moment to get victims the compensation they deserve, and the legislation will be before the House shortly.
In recent decades, there have been numerous scandals that have left shaken public faith in our institutions, and rebuilding that confidence will require those affected to see that politicians are being honest with them and to believe it. Just like the postmasters, victims of the infected blood scandal have been subject to unimaginable trauma during their search for justice. So can the Prime Minister put their minds at ease and tell the House what undertakings he has made to ensure the government is not limping to the election on payments that they are owed by the British state?
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the inflected blood scandal, as I've said before, I'm acutely aware of the strength of feeling on this issue and the suffering of all those who were impacted by this dreadful scandal. I gave evidence to the inquiry myself last year, and as I said then, I recognise that thousands have suffered for decades. As he knows, there is an independent inquiry. The Minister for the Cabinet Office, because this is an incredibly complex issue, as he well knows, updated Parliament with the latest government position just before the Christmas recess, announced that the Cabinet Office was appointing an expert group of clinical, legal and social care experts, so it had the relevant expertise to make informed decisions responding to the inquiry's recommendations on compensation when they come, and confirmed that the Department for Health will implement a fully bespoke psychological service for people infected and affected. We have also committed to providing an update to Parliament on next steps through an oral statement within 25 sitting days of the publication of the final report. But I'll end where I began. This is a deeply awful scandal, and we will do what we need to make it right.
McCartney.
Thank you, Speaker. There is a plan for at least 2,000 single young men who have come here illegally to soon be housed just 3 miles from the centre of Lincoln at RAF Scampton in my right honourable friend's constituency of Gainsborough, if the Home Office ministers have their way. On top of the huge and rising costs and recent advice from civil servants to Home Office ministers to can the plan, what reassurance can the Prime Minister and his Home Secretary give that Scampton will not replicate the scandalous incidences that occurred in Cambridge when 300 Libyan trainees were housed at RAF Bassingbourn in 2014?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to raise the concerns of his constituents, and I want to assure him that we want asylum accommodation to have as little impact as possible on the local community. I understand the Home Office has put in place a number of measures, including a specialist security provider working on site 24/7, CCTV, and they're working with the local police as well. But I know he agrees with me that the only way to fully stop this problem and ensure that local communities are not seeing the housing of illegal migrants, whether that's in large sites or in hotels, is to have a plan to stop the both. That's what this party and this government does, and it's Labour who are blocking us every step of the way.
Stephen Flynn, SNP Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by echoing the sentiments of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in relation to the heroic bravery of Alexei Navalny, we all must continue to be united in our opposition to Vladimir Putin. Mr. Speaker, as it stands, some 60% of the buildings in Gaza are either damaged or destroyed. Much of the farmland is in ruin. Some 30,000 people are dead, 70,000 injured, and 1.4 million people are currently sheltering in Rafah, awaiting an imminent Israeli onslaught. Surely the Prime Minister must accept that that does not amount to self-defence.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I share the concern of many members about the high rate of civilian casualties and indeed the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and that is why we have called consistently for an immediate humanitarian pause, which would allow for the safe release of hostages and more aid going into Gaza so that we create the sustainable conditions for a long-term and enduring ceasefire. That is what our diplomatic efforts are focused on, and that is what I impressed upon the Israeli Prime Minister last week when I spoke to him.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, tonight this House will have the opportunity to join with the majority of the international community and say that enough is enough, that the killing in Gaza must stop and that the hostages must be released. And the best way to do that is to send a clear and united message that we back an immediate ceasefire. Surely all of us, irrespective of our political allegiance, can agree on that very issue.
Mr. Speaker, of course we want to see the fighting in Gaza end as soon as possible and never again allow Hamas to carry out the appalling terrorist attacks that Israel was subject to. But he talks about the UN resolution, but just calling for an immediate full ceasefire now, which collapses back into fighting within days or weeks, is not in anyone's interest, Mr. Speaker. We must work towards a permanent ceasefire, and that's why the right approach is the approach that we've set out and the United States have set out in their resolution, which is for an immediate humanitarian pause to get hostages out and aid in so that we then can create the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire. And in the meantime, we're doing everything we can to increase the amount of humanitarian aid that we bring into Gaza, something I discussed with the King of Jordan last week, and we will have more updates in the coming days of more airdrops into Gaza, but also just in the last couple of days have managed to deliver family tents into Gaza, which are providing much-needed shelter for very vulnerable people.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Key to the much-needed regeneration of Aylesbury are new link roads to cut congestion. Money from the cancelled part of HS2 is meant to be paying towards them. That's only right, given the destruction that's being caused by the construction of the first part of this unwanted railway. But the cash hasn't arrived yet. So can my right honourable friend assure my constituents they will get the roads they need so they can spend less time sitting in traffic jams and more time growing the local economy?
Well, as my honourable friend knows, last autumn we announced the government's vision to redirect £36 billion of savings from HS2 to invest in hundreds of transport projects across the country, including possible increased funding for two projects that I know my honourable friend has campaigned on tirelessly, the South East Aylesbury Link Road and the Aylesbury Eastern Link Road. I know he's met with the relevant minister on a number of occasions to discuss these proposals, and I can tell him that the details of how these funding uplifts will be allocated will be decided very shortly.
Neil Hanbait.
Over 40,000 North Sea oil and gas jobs are at risk from an incoming Labour administration, and neither Labour, the Tories or the SNP have lifted a finger to save Grangemouth oil refinery from closure. With the passing of last night's petroleum bill, the UK government gave not one but two fingers to Scotland's energy ambitions within the UK. In today's money, can the Prime Minister explain, in today's money, the UK has received over £300 billion in tax receipts from North Sea oil and gas. So why can't the UK government find £80 million to secure Grangemouth's future into and profitability beyond 2025?
Mr. Speaker, as I've previously told the House, the future of Grangemouth is a commercial decision for their owners. The site will remain operating as a refinery until at least May 2025. The UK and the Scottish governments are working together to make sure that there are sufficient assurances in place for the support of employees. But when it comes to backing Scottish energy, Mr. Speaker, it's this government that just this week has ensured that we can support British North Sea oil and gas, safeguarding 200,000 jobs and increasing our energy security. It's the SNP and the Labour Party that oppose that, but we will always back our fantastic North Sea economy.
Virginia Crosby.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree with me and Welsh farmers like Gareth Wyn-Jones that our farmers and food security are vital and that the agricultural budget should be ring-fenced, unlike the Welsh Labour government propped up by Plaid, which is determined to force our farmers out of business with its approach to nitrate vulnerable zones, TB, and its new sustainable farming scheme, which, using Welsh Government's own analysis, is forecast to result in 5,500 job losses and a £200 million hit to the Welsh economy.
My honourable friend is an excellent campaigner on behalf of her local farming community, and I know that she's been working hard with Gareth Wyn-Jones to raise their voice, especially where there is so much concern, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we're supporting farmers with more money to grow more British food, in contrast to the plans that she highlighted, which would decimate farming communities in Wales. It's the opposite of what is needed. While we will always back our rural communities across the UK, it's Labour that would take them back to square one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now over 2 years since the fan-led review on football governance was produced. Will the Prime Minister commit now to setting up an independent regulator with the upfront power to intervene to achieve a fairer distribution of the enormous riches which football has, to ensure that no community in the future loses its football club like happened in Bury? Will he commit to bring legislation forward urgently, or is he going to leave it for a future Labour government to act on behalf of football fans?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the independent regulator will put fans back at the heart of football and help to deliver a sustainable future for all clubs. That delivers on our manifesto commitment, and the government is engaged in discussions with industry, and as was part of our King's speech, as the honourable gentleman knows. But I'm glad he brought up Bury Football Club, because it was the honourable member on this side of the House for Bury who ensured £1 million of funding to safeguard that football club, and that's what we're doing to communities up and down the country, Mr. Speaker.
GP surgeries promised in planning applications take far too long to be built. So can we clear away the obstacles and make it easier for our amazing family doctors to use additional consulting rooms that they're happy with elsewhere in the community, so that GPs and the many extra prescribing nurses they're now employing can see more patients now while they wait for bespoke premises to be built?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question, something that he speaks from a point of authority. Now, he knows that we do have high standards to ensure that GPs must provide services from premises that meet all the criteria required, but I do understand that it is possible for those services to be provided at alternative locations that meet the contract requirements. I'll happily ensure that the Health Secretary looks into his suggestions for more flexibility, but I know he will also welcome our recent plans to expand the range of services available at pharmacies, saving many people time and hassle to get treatment for 7 common ailments at their local pharmacists, easing the pressure on our GPs and speeding up the care that people deserve.
Pete Wishart.
Mr. Speaker, I was in the House on 18th March 2003 when this House voted to go to war on Iraq on the demands of the then Labour government. What followed was death, misery and destruction on an almost unimaginable scale. Voting against the Iraq war was the vote that I'm most proud of in my time in this House. Today, after 29,000 deaths in Gaza, we face a vote of similar significance. Does the Prime Minister believe that MPs today should look back with that same pride, knowing that they have done everything possible to stop the death, destruction and misery tonight?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, nobody wants to see the fighting in Gaza go on for a moment longer than is necessary. Nobody wants to see innocent civilians suffer, and that's why we're doing absolutely everything we can to bring about an immediate humanitarian pause, allowing for the safe release of hostages, which the honourable gentleman failed to mention, I believe, but also getting more aid into Gaza to create the conditions for a genuinely sustainable ceasefire. That is the position that is shared by our allies. That is what our diplomatic efforts are focused on, and that's what our motion tonight will reflect.
Andrew Rosenberg.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I've had the privilege to be spending a lot of time with the law-abiding, tax-paying, hard-working, patriotic people of Romford in recent months, and they've been telling me what they think. So, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister if he agrees with the people of Romford that we need a radical plan to control immigration and stop illegal immigration, that we need to regain sovereignty over our human rights laws in this country, that we need to tell the Mayor of London we need more police to stop crime in the London Borough of Havering, we need a fair funding settlement for Havering, so will he come with me to Romford Market, follow the footsteps of Margaret Thatcher, meet the people of Romford, because the one thing I can tell him they don't want is to be taken back into the European Union by a socialist government.
Can I welcome my honourable friend? Can I welcome my honourable friend back to his place? Can I say I agree with everything he said, and I look forward to visiting him and his Romford constituents at the earliest opportunity.
Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a recent meeting of Warwickshire County Council, children with special educational needs were described by some county councillors as requiring, and I quote, some form of strict correction, or were, and I quote, just really badly behaved kids. Other inappropriate language was used. Parents of SEND children across the country have been outraged by this. 30,000 of them have signed a petition calling for those councillors' resignation. Will he condemn the Conservative councillors' language and urge them to do the right thing and resign?
Mr. Speaker, I haven't seen the details of those comments on this issue, but more generally, the government does have a strong track record of supporting those with disabilities. It's important that children with special educational needs do receive the right support in the right place at the right time. We've seen increased funding for SEN by 60% over this Parliament to over £10 billion, and most recently the Education and Health Departments are piloting a new project to improve access to specialty support in mainstream primary schools, because we want to make sure that these children get all the support and opportunities that they deserve.
Bailey.
Mr. Speaker, now we've legislated to give the public ID verification options on social media. Tech companies know the safety value and popularity of this because they offer it now, but for a big fee every month, and it's not good enough. Bereaved parents are campaigning for more measures to protect kids online. Fraudsters are routinely exploiting fake social media accounts to scam, and fears of global political interference in elections from faceless, traceless bots are creating the perfect cyber storm. Will my right honourable friend use his influence to get tech companies to get on with offering robust, visible and free verification measures as soon as possible to keep people safe?
Can I start by commending my honourable friend for her work on this issue? And she's absolutely right that user verification can be a powerful tool to keep people safe online. The Online Safety Act, as she knows, requires companies to offer all adults optional user identity verification. Companies will also need to take firm action to improve safety for children in particular, and Ofcom will be able to monitor tech companies and have strong powers to ensure they comply. But I can tell her that the Home Secretary is meeting with the industry on Monday next week and will be sure to raise the points that she has mentioned today.
Very Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
A KPMG study finds a strong economic case to remove power cables over the time. And despite my questions to previous Prime Ministers, we are no further forward. Can this Prime Minister finally secure a commitment from National Grid to implement its clear legal obligation and fund this vital work? This fog on the Tyne is impeding local businesses and risks possible net GVA benefits of up to £1.2 billion. Our great river needs action now.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to look into the issue that the Honourable Lady raised, but what would be damaging to the North East and the Tyne are her party's plans to stick with their completely ridiculous 2030 decarbonisation target with absolutely no plan to pay for it, which just means higher taxes for everyone in her constituency and the country.
John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Britain's food security, compromised by cheap foreign imports, now faces a parallel threat. All kinds of industrialisation in the countryside, from large solar plants to interconnectors and substations, and now to huge pylons covering 87 miles of countryside. These will blot the landscape and use up valuable growing land, filling the Fenland big skies. Knowing that his bow burns with gold, like my own, will he ensure that he joins my fight for our green and pleasant land and make sure that food security and energy security are not competitors?
My honourable friend raises an excellent point about our food security. We have taken steps that he has supported the government in doing to protect prime agricultural land from large-scale solar developments, which I know will be warmly welcomed. But also, our announcements this week at the NFU conference demonstrate our support to increase our country's food security, backing farmers with more funding, enhancing their productivity to produce great British food. All of that, as he knows, and including our green and pleasant land, we put at risk by the party opposite. Not only do they not want to back our farmers, they also want to impose top-down planning targets which would concrete over the countryside that he and I both love.
Sure.
In December, the Cabinet Minister for Equalities told this House that she had engaged, and I quote, extensively with LGBT organisations since her appointment 18 months ago. A Freedom of Information answer published this week reveals that, in fact, the Minister hasn't met a single LGBT organisation, but has met 2 fringe groups that actively campaign against transgender rights. What is the problem the Prime Minister and a section of his party have with trans people, and his Equalities Minister has with the truth?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've always said, first of all, this government has a proud track record of supporting those in the LGBT community and will continue to do so. And I've also always said that those who are questioning their gender and identity should be treated with the utmost dignity and compassion and sensitivity as they consider those questions. But it is completely reasonable, alongside that, to highlight the importance of biological sex when it comes to those questions. Nobody should be stigmatised or demonised for pointing out that fact.
Robert Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Education Select Committee has heard compelling evidence to support the strengthening of guidance to keep mobile phones out of classrooms and break times. But over the course of our screen time inquiry, we continue to hear deeply disturbing evidence about the risks to young people from too much exposure to social media too early. Can I urge the Prime Minister to seek the swiftest possible implementation of the Online Safety Act and to consider whether it is time to review the age of digital consent?
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his work in this issue? And he knows that we do have a plan when it comes to education and protecting children online. The Secretary of State is making sure that we can implement the Online Safety Act as quickly as possible with Ofcom, but we have also published new guidance banning mobile phones in schools to minimise disruption and improve behaviour and educational attainment in the classroom. But we are crucially going beyond that, because what our children see online is of the utmost importance to us, and we want to make sure that we protect their safety and also their mental health.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When important matters of life and death are voted on in this House, does the Prime Minister think MPs should vote according to their party whip or according to their conscience?
Mr. Speaker, this afternoon the House will have an opportunity to consider its approach to the situation in Israel and Gaza. Our position is crystal clear. We have called and will always call for an immediate humanitarian pause, which would allow the safe release of hostages and more aid going into Gaza to create the conditions for a genuinely sustainable ceasefire. But just calling for an immediate full ceasefire now, which collapses it back into fighting in days or weeks, would not be in anyone's interest, Mr. Speaker. We are committed not just to an immediate humanitarian pause, but also to finding a lasting resolution to this conflict, which delivers on the promise of a two-state solution and ensures that Israelis and Palestinians can live in the future with dignity and security.
Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems that with the exception of the British Transport Police, all other police forces will treat non-contact sex crimes as they would perhaps the theft of a bike, petty retail crime or antisocial behaviour. Will the Prime Minister facilitate a meeting between myself, colleagues and the Home Secretary in order to give priority to these acts of crime to ensure that women and young girls get the protection they deserve?
Mr. Speaker, of course we want women and girls to get the protection that they deserve, and I'm pleased that our violence against women and girls strategy is showing results, improving the safety of our streets, increasing sentences for rapists, but I will make sure that he gets the meeting that he needs with the Home Secretary or relevant policing ministers to discuss his concerns.
Kate Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I heard the Prime Minister's responses to the Leader of the Opposition, and just like the Secretary of State's claims that delays on compensation are wild, baseless allegations, his answers are unbelievable. And the response from the benches opposite to the quote from my constituent Chris Head was completely disrespectful. The reality is, we wouldn't have any action without the ITV serialisation of the sub-postmaster scandal. You can shout all you like, but we all know that that's the case. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's promised a new law to swiftly exonerate and compensate victims, and today he said shortly. So will he commit today to ensuring that this is brought forward before the next general election?
Yes, the legislation will be brought forward before the House very, very soon, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Speaker, after Network Rail's so-called signalling improvement works, there's been...
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions there because, of course, the debate and the vote on Gaza and a ceasefire there is going to follow on in about 20 minutes' time. But that final question from the Labour MP about the post office situation and about compensation for the wronged sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses was very much at the heart of Sir Keir Starmer's questions this week to the Prime Minister following a blistering performance from the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, who refuted and accused the former chairman, whom she sacked, of untruths. We're going to look very seriously at some of those allegations that she made with our guest for this part of the programme. For the government, the Energy Minister, Andrew Bowie. For Labour, who in fact faced Kemi Badenoch across the dispatch box, the Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, and Leila Nathoo, the BBC's political correspondent. Keir Starmer devoted all his questions, actually, to the scandal of the Post Office, but this ongoing row between the Business Secretary and the former chairman, whom, as I said, she actually got rid of. What do we know now?
Well, interesting, Keir Starmer, I think, chose to go on this, trying to drive a wedge between the Prime Minister and his Business Secretary over the tone and the accusations that she has made against the former chairman, Henry Staunton, of the Post Office. Interesting, the tone, I think, because, you know, in discussions about the Post Office and the Horizon scandal, it's generally been a kind of cross-party consensus that this is a scandal that's been allowed to go on for too long, that hasn't been tackled. So the tone, I think, was quite muted and less personal that we've seen in recent weeks between Keir Starmer. But interestingly, Rishi Sunak, when challenged by Keir Starmer, to repeat the accusations that Kemi Badenoch made that Henry Staunton has been lying about what conversations he had, he didn't. choose to repeat those claims by the business secretary, instead actually choosing to broaden it out to try and draw attention to the fact that they are trying to do this after all and get the exonerations and the compensations paid swiftly. So I think a notable distancing from Rishi Sunak from the comments that Kemi Badenoch made.
Well, Andrew Bow, would you repeat the words of the business secretary, as quoted by Sir Keir Starmer, that the former chair of the Post Office, Henry Staunton, is lying when he said he was asked to go slow on compensation payments to wronged sub-postmasters and postmistresses?
Well, look, the Secretary of State for Business and Trade set out her version of events at the dispatch box, and she was very clear over what the discussions that she had had with Henry Staunton and the reasons why he was dismissed from his position.
And would you repeat her words?
As I said, the Secretary of State for Business and Trade has set that out clearly, what she saw as the position and the reasons why she felt that she had to dismiss him. But the really important thing here is not the he said, she said that I know that Westminster is focused on or the media find interesting.
But that's what the business secretary's focusing on.
But actually what we are doing to support those people who were so failed by so many
delaying the compensation payments. But hang on a second, Andrew.
The government set up the independent
the
inquiry.
Secretary of State, Kemi Badenoch, has made it about he said, she said, and she attacked Henry Staunton, rightly or wrongly. And what I don't understand is why neither the Prime Minister nor you, as a minister in that government, are prepared to back up Kemi Badenoch in terms of the words that she used in tweets and in the House of Commons, where she has parliamentary privilege, that the former chair of the Post Office is lying.
Well, the Secretary of State is absolutely within her rights, and in fact, you would expect her to hit back at accusations that she claims are false, and she did that in no uncertain terms on Monday afternoon. However, I did think it was a rather strange argument to pick or topic to go on by Keir Starmer this afternoon, given his position as head of the Crown Prosecution Service, who actually convicted wrongly 3 sub-postmasters back when he was in charge. So I do think it's rather a bit. You mentioned that up until this point we have had large cross-party consensus on the need to right the wrongs of the past and support all those people who were wrongly convicted and that deserve compensation. So for Keir Starmer to now go on this, I think is a bit disappointing, given his own track record in regard to this issue is not exactly blemish-free.
Jonathan? I think just on that point, that's obviously nonsense. The Director of the Crown Prosecution Service doesn't have personal knowledge of every case in their time. Just put that to one side. That's a clear diversion. These are extraordinary allegations that were started in the Sunday Times, an extraordinary set of statements from the business secretary at the weekend and then in Parliament. These are very serious, so Parliament should be looking at them. I don't like this attitude from the government that this Parliament shouldn't be looking at this. This is not just about the issue, which is very, very important. It's about faith in government. And this is the last thing we needed. I mean, we did not want to see anything like this, but I don't know who's telling the truth here. I know they both can't be right. So we've got to get to the bottom of that. The Cabinet Office should do that. I think you're right to say, how do you ultimately try and rebuild the public's faith in this? Well, let's get on and do it. Let's see the legislation promised by the Prime Minister. Let's see what the approach will be. It's quite complicated. We're talking to them about the best way to do that. Of course, the other thing this week is this story. There's a further story about my upset number about the Canada trade deal and statements to Parliament. So it's not a great picture, to be honest.
Right, and you say you don't know who to believe, or you don't know who's telling the truth, but you asked the Secretary of State directly a question when you responded earlier in the week. And Kemi Badenoch said, the Shadow Minister, you, asked whether I would categorically state that no instruction was given to delay payments. Yes, I can. We have no evidence whatever that any official said that. Is that not good enough for you?
Well, what has, of course, emerged yesterday evening is a memo of a meeting that Henry Staunton has published that has a point in there that could certainly be interpreted, I think, as being a go slow, instruction. So again, I honestly, I don't know where the truth sits here. I do think, given how eroded public trust is, and it's not the first scandal. We've seen Hillsborough, we've seen Bloody Sunday. We've got to recognise the public are asking for transparency and clarity here. I think the government's got to come and get to the bottom of this.
Well, you say it could be interpreted by Henry Staunton in such a way. Let's just show you the headline in the Times. Post Office boss was told, don't rip off the Band-Aid on finances. This is the memo that Henry Staunton had said he'd made a contemporaneous note of the meeting with top civil servant last year, says scandal hit company was ordered to hobble into the election without solving the organisation's long-term problems. Now, it's, by the way, refuted and denied by the department and by the Permanent Secretary. But can you see how that might be interpreted in such a way as to slow down and stall payments?
I mean, look, Jo, you just said this has been refuted and denied by the Permanent Secretary, by the Department for Business and Trade, and by the Secretary of State for Business and Trade. I think what we need to be focusing on now is letting the independent inquiry into what happened to complete its work, ensuring that compensation has gotten to all those who had wrong done to them over the last few decades, and bringing forward the legislation that will overturn the wrongful convictions. That is where the focus of the government is.
Where is it? Is it really good enough for the Prime Minister to say it's coming very, very soon?
It is coming soon, but we've got to recognise, and we are working with the Labour Party on this, it is a very complex piece of legislation. We've got to ensure that those people who were rightfully convicted are not by accident let off through this process. So the people who were wrongfully convicted absolutely need to have those convictions overturned, and they need to be pardoned in the full face of the public, and that is the right thing that we need to do. However, in doing so, we cannot be in a place where people who were rightfully sent to jail for wrongdoing get off. So we need to ensure that it's watertight, it's right, but it is coming very soon. I know the Secretary of State for Justice is working very closely.
Is that good enough for you?
I think what would have been the best way to respond to this would have been a statement from the government being very clear that this is where we're at with the legislation, this is the timescale for it, this is how we're going to do it. There's no problem with transparency. I mean, the question is the method, essentially the process, making sure from a kind of constitutional point of view, the Justice Department, the legal judiciary are comfortable with the approach as well. We're having these conversations frankly, openly. There's no problem with transparency behind that side of it. That's the way to do it. And again, I think the public will just look at this and they'll say, what is going on? You know.
Well,
but the public need to have confidence that this is a watertight piece of legislation, and they need to have confidence that those who do deserve to have their cases overturned have that action taken, but that those people who were doing wrong and were convicted.
The thing is, people have waited for such a long time. And also, Kevin Hollinrake, the minister responsible under Kemi Badenoch, moved unbelievably swiftly earlier this year in January, and now it looks as if the government is dragging its feet.
I can absolutely categorically guarantee there is no feet dragging of any type across government on this issue. We just need to ensure that we get this legislation right.
We've also got to say that just as, when this emerged at the weekend, and I think completely understandably, a lot of people, particularly involved in the contaminated blood scandal, were saying, well, hang on, why are we having a delay? What is the government's delay? And I can understand why they're asking their MPs, the government, about that. So again, some clarity, some transparency, I think is what we need.
Let's have a look at this headline in the Financial Times. It concerns the Business Secretary again. Canada contradicts Kemi Badenoch claims on ongoing trade talks. Latest spat for Business Secretary as Ottawa's diplomat in London writes to MPs saying those negotiations just aren't happening. What do you make of that, Andrew?
Well, there are negotiations between Canada on various elements of trade policy.
No negotiations happening.
There are, and I think that the Secretary of State and the Department for Business and Trade has made that clear in their answer to this allegation, to this story that I read this morning alongside everybody else, and the negotiations continue.
Well, the Canadian High Commissioner, who's quoted in the piece, has written to the House of Commons Business Select Committee to insist Badenoch's claimed talks have not happened.
We are in discussions with many countries around the world, including Canada, on how we improve relations and improve the trading relationship between our countries and with various trading blocs at this time. And as the Secretary of State...
That isn't correct. I mean, there were talks ongoing about improving the rollover deal that we had when we left the European Union. Those were broken off. That was the story, particularly a huge concern to the automotive sector. Also affects actually cheese industry as well. Some very specific issues involved there. In the second reading of the Pacific Trade Bill ratification legislation, the Business Secretary unprompted intervened to say those press reports are wrong, talks are still ongoing, and the Canadians have clarified the situation. I mean, there's no ambiguity about this one. They're very clear they were unilaterally broken off.
What does it say about Kemi Badenoch?
Look, the Secretary of State is delivering new trade deals for the United Kingdom, building
Andrew,
on the Brexit.
Andrew, I'm not talking broadly. Specifically, we've got this post office row, which she has chosen, rightly or wrongly, to absolutely fuel and escalate, and maybe she's right to do so. And then we have a direct contradiction from the Canadian High Commissioner and Canada saying there are no trade talks. What does it say about Kemi Badenoch?
I think it says that she stands up for what she believes in, she stands up for what is right, and she's absolutely determined to deliver on this government's agenda, be that on delivering new trade deals, be that on building on the Brexit advantages that we have gotten and the new export opportunities that we have, and growing the business sector and supporting them across the United Kingdom, as well as absolutely, incredibly importantly, delivering compensation to all those who were wronged by the Horizon scandal.
Right, I mean, Kemi Badenoch is currently the front-runner to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. Is some of her combative performance wrapped up in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, that will certainly be one interpretation of why she has chosen to go quite so strongly against Henry Staunton on this. And yeah, I mean, there is obviously positioning and jostling within the Conservative Party going on right, left and centre, actually, for what will be the next incarnation of the Conservative Party should the party lose the general election. And she is somebody who is popular with the membership. She is being talked up. Of course, she furiously denies at every challenge that she is doing anything of the sort. But certainly, she will be seen as boosting her profile, trying to sort of give an impression of someone who will stand up for what she believes in, and she thinks that is appealing to Tory members who will ultimately choose the next Tory leader.
She doesn't give an impression of standing up for what she believes in. I know Kemi, and she does stand up for what she believes in.
Standing up for what you believe in is one thing.
Right now, what we are all focused on in government is delivering for the British people, delivering on our plan.
Andrew, you can save the part political stuff.
I mean, clearly she is a front runner to take over in the event of an election defeat. I think she devotes significant time to that. I think she's not the only cabinet minister who's doing that, so it's not a criticism in that sense. But to say she's not focused on this, I think, would be a little bit of a
let's move on to a different department and a different row with personnel. BBC News story, David Neil, immigration and borders watchdog, sacked for leaking critical reports. And these cover two areas. One of them about security lapses around private jets landing at London City Airport. The headline here says hundreds of high-risk flights land in the UK unchecked. Borders watchdog issues dramatic warning amid a major new immigration scandal. Well, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, sacked David Neil. There was also this report in the Times: 1 in 4 foreign care workers abuse UK visa rules. Inspections revealed that the Home Office issued 275 visas to a care home that did not exist. It's chaos.
No, it's not chaos. I mean, and look, for goodness sake, of course the Home Secretary has to deal with people who might be leaking confidential information.
Well, you know why he says it's because he had 15 reports that have been ignored, left on a shelf, detailing these important issues that haven't been looked at.
On that last issue, I mean, we are taking action. The Home Secretary just announced yesterday that we're clamping down hard on those who are abusing the rules on care workers coming into this country. So we are taking action on that, but it's absolutely absurd to think that the Home Secretary shouldn't take action.
You are now, but he's just said that they're giving out visas to a care home that doesn't even exist. I mean, the point is, as we discussed actually before PMQ's on the programme, the rhetoric is tough. The rhetoric is harsh. But actually, I mean, James Cleverly here saying today in Parliament, we've laid an order to ban overseas care workers from bringing dependents. And then we have this leaked story saying giving out visas to care homes that don't exist. The rhetoric doesn't match the reality. You talk up how hard you're going to be when it comes to the issue of immigration, and you fail to deliver.
And we are delivering. We're taking action on those who abuse student visas. We're taking action on those who abuse care home visas. We're taking action to stop the boats coming across the channel so that illegal immigration can be brought down and indeed stopped.
But you've been in power since 2010 promising, in terms of the small boats, that you would stop them, not reduce it, you'd stop them. And then it's revealed by David Neil, now sacked, that actually there are scams going on in terms of your care home visas.
Which is why we're coming down hard. There shouldn't be scams, and that's why we're dealing with it. But it's absolutely right that the Home Secretary should be allowed to discipline or dismiss a senior official who is leaking confidential papers from within the Home Office. That is absolutely right and proper that happens. And at the same time that we're dealing with those issues that the immigration system has.
But why haven't his reports been published? That's the key question, because they've revealed things that you don't want to hear.
But we're taking action on these things.
But why not publish his reports? That's why he's been giving them to the media.
We're taking action on those who are abusing care home visas. We're taking action on those who are abusing student visas. And we're taking action on the small boats in the Channel.
But answer Leila's question, why haven't they been published?
Well, look, I mean, because we're taking action on these issues already.
In public domain, I mean,
I just find it.
What can you say?
I just cannot believe that there's any criticism of a Home Secretary taking tough action to prevent confidential papers, serious confidential papers.
Because it's exposing the fact that you're not publishing these reports because they are detailing failures by the government and by the Home Office. Look, we had your colleague, the Conservative MP Steve Bryan, sitting where you are, saying, I don't like the government's rhetoric on migrant care workers. My constituency in Winchester don't like this rhetoric, and I don't like it either. Yes, clamp down on the people coming in and abusing the health and care visa route, but don't cut off your nose to spite your face in pursuit of numbers, because when they're not there to look after mum and dad, it'll be a bigger election issue than immigration numbers, in my opinion. Do you agree with him?
No, frankly, I don't agree with him, because we do need to take action to deal with those who are abusing the system. You've just seen that report in the Times.
He's talking about the rhetoric. He's talking about the rhetoric.
But it's really important that we get immigration numbers under control. The British people are, frankly, very fed up with being seen as being a country that is far too open to immigration, and that in many parts of the country have services under severe pressure. And so that is what we need to take action to deal with. And we are taking action to deal with it. We are going to bring numbers down, and we're taking action to deal with illegal immigration at the same
Jonathan,
time.
do you agree?
What's the Labour plan?
I think immigration is too high. You can be very proud of people coming to this country, but the level you've extended it to, I mean, you've tripled net legal immigration to the country.
So what will Labour do?
Well, frankly, we will make difficult decisions. That headline you've got there...
Just because actually you're going to keep the migration crackdown on health worker relatives, aren't you?
You've got to recognise there are, given what they have done, which is frankly very much different to what you promised in the Brexit referendum, a huge increase in legal immigration, we'll have to go along with some of this in the short term. The difference between us is, on things like care workers, we have a plan for the care sector, a collective sectoral agreement in place to drive up standards.
It's going to have a big dent in it if you don't allow them to bring the dependents over.
You've got to have a situation where, if you are recognising we're too dependent on immigration for certain sectors of the economy, you've got a domestic plan with it. So we have that. They haven't got that.
So you agree with the government?
I deplore their rhetoric. I think they're... for a government that has enormously extended immigration, their pretense at trying to control it, you're not doing that. You've tripled it.
Right. But the Conservative MP, Steve Bryan, is too liberal for you.
No, he's not too liberal, but he's in a position where he's not having to make any decisions, is he? He's coming as a backbencher to this debate. We've got to make decisions that will affect the net level of immigration to the country. I cannot tell you, proud as I am of people come to this country, that we can have the levels they've reached it to when house building is at record low levels. I mean, there are sustainable pressures.
It wasn't that long ago that you wanted freedom of movement, you wanted to take us back into the European Union. Look, we are the only party here with a plan to actually deal with the high levels of immigration that the British people find unacceptable. And we're the only party, certainly, that has a plan to deal with the boats coming across the track.
You're saying you're the only people to deal with the high levels of immigration that the Conservative Party have delivered. That is honestly your pitch, Andrew. I mean, that is, I'm sorry, that's
what's
risible.
Your pitch? I mean, there's this idea that you've got some sort of plan to build up the domestic workforce. I mean, where is it? We've not seen it.
You can read it. I mean, if you weren't so focused on nonsense schemes like Rwanda, which are very expensive, waste resources, have had no effect, you might do some meaningful things that would have a genuine impact.
The Rwanda scheme is yet to be enacted into law.
Exactly.
And even as that is the case, crossings of boats in the Channel have come down by a third in the past year.
And you attribute that to Rwanda not happening?
No, I attribute that to the strong action that we're taking.
£400 million to deliver nothing, spend it properly and stop messing around and stop telling the British people you're going to fix something where you're actually just making...
We've only got a few moments left and actually I think the debate is going to start fairly soon, and that is the debate on whether to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. It's been brought as an Opposition Day debate by the SNP. We don't yet know, as I understand it, whether the Speaker is going to call one or two of the amendments. But let me just show you what the parties are proposing. Ceasefire in Gaza. The SNP's motion is an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. Labour have put forward an amendment that says an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. And the government then, also quite late in the day, put forward their own amendment, which is an immediate humanitarian pause. How's this all going to unfold?
Well, so the key moment is which amendment will be selected, because the SNP will have their motion. Labour are hoping that their motion will get selected so that they don't have to face the prospect of dozens of Labour backbenchers and potentially frontbenchers voting with the SNP But the government has complicated the situation by putting forward its own amendment, which dilutes the chance of Labour amendment getting selected. So we're still in that moment of jeopardy, if you like, for the Labour Party, because if the Labour Party do not have a motion of their own to vote on, then Labour MPs will be forced to decide whether to support the SNP motion, which straightforwardly calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, or not.
Will it be a sacking offence if frontbench Labour MPs back the SNP motion?
Oh, look, that's the secondary politics of this. The main thing is the substance of those motions, and we want to vote on our policy, which is put forward there. The reason our motion is better than the SNP one is it's about a ceasefire, but it's about a way to get there. And there are major omissions from the SNP position in terms of a two-state solution, in terms of the ICJ.
Yeah, except we don't know. Except we don't know, do we, if it's going to be selected. It may well be the best amendment, as you have just set out, but we don't know if it'll be selected. David Lammy, your colleague, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, said in interviews yesterday it will be collective responsibility, and it will be incumbent on Shadow ministers to either abstain or not vote at all. So will it be a sacking offence if Labour frontbenchers back the SNP?
Well, the collective responsibility is collective responsibility. But I don't think, to be honest, when we're looking at this, the issue is what will happen in the Labour Party in a hypothetical situation.
Have you not agonised? Has the Labour Party not agonised over this then?
Of course, everyone in the country has agonised over the appalling situation.
No. Agonised over what to do and what to say because of divisions within the party.
Well, the party is not divided on the need for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. I mean,
but it is quite important to know how Keir Starmer will deal with frontbenchers who might not want to toe the line or support the party leader's position, because you are seeking to form the next government of this country. You're going to go to the British people seeking to remove us as a government and to form a government as the Labour Party, and we need to know if Keir Starmer's going to...
Well, do you know what? You're going to find out fairly...
Because that's exactly how he's behaved in every one of these votes, exercising
We've run out of
collective
time.
responsibility.
And you're going to find out this afternoon. It's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. Bye-bye.